There's a moment that arises in everyone's life when the world feels just a little too loud, when emotions roar louder than logic, and peace seems like a distant shore you can see but can't seem to reach. Maybe it was after a long day of conflict or one quiet night when your thoughts refuse to settle. That moment comes to each of us. And it comes bearing a simple question. Is it possible to live with calm in the midst of chaos? In the heart of ancient wisdom, there's a path, worn by the footsteps of seekers, softened by centuries of reflection, that leads to an answer. And that answer is not a promise of a perfect life. It's not an escape from sorrow. It's something quieter, deeper. A way to remain unmoved while life swirls around you. A way to stand in the storm and feel only your breath. It begins with presence. The kind of presence that requires courage, not just calm. To face your emotions, not suppress them, not flee from them, but look at them with clarity. Imagine what it means to truly understand that your anger isn't who you are, that your fear isn't permanent, that your sadness doesn't define your value. Imagine being able to witness these feelings without being consumed by them. This is not just poetic, it is practice. It is the Buddhist path of emotional clarity and mastery. The mind is a mirror. It reflects whatever we place in front of it. And when that mirror is clouded by old wounds, regrets, or fears, our entire world becomes blurry. But when we learn to breathe through discomfort, to sit with silence, to observe without judgment, the mirror clears. And for perhaps the first time, we see ourselves not as broken beings in need of fixing, but as whole souls simply learning to feel. The teachings that flow from this space are not loud teachings. They do not shout over you. They whisper, they invite. The Buddha once said, "Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Focus the mind on the present moment." These are not just words to memorize. They are lifelines to hold on to when emotions pull us under. Because in the present moment, in that breath you're taking right now, there is nothing you need to fix, nothing to fear. There is only now. And in the now, you are free. But how do we begin? The journey always starts with mindfulness. Not a concept, but a living awareness that transforms how we see and experience the world. It's the gentle skill of noticing without reacting. It's not about shutting off your thoughts. It's about stepping back and watching them. Seeing the anger rise like a wave and choosing not to surf it. Watching the sadness settle like fog and choosing not to get lost in it. This watching, this noticing, it's what begins to create space inside of you. Space between the trigger and the reaction. Space between the story and the truth. That space becomes your sanctuary. It's where wisdom lives. It's where choice returns. And in that sacred pause, you reclaim your power. Each time you breathe with intention, you are building a bridge back to yourself. Each time you resist the urge to lash out, to shut down, to numb, you are rewriting your story. You are saying, "I no longer belong to chaos. I no longer serve fear. I belong to peace. I serve presence." This is not weakness. This is strength at its purest. Because anyone can react. It takes real courage to remain still, to respond with care instead of impulse. In Buddhism, this presence is not a goal. It is a way of being, a way of walking through the world with open eyes and a soft heart. And perhaps nothing teaches this better than the practice of meditation. Not the kind you perform, but the kind you live. The quiet sitting where you meet your mind again and again, no matter how many times it wanders. The gentle returning over and over, like the tide kissing the shore. And you begin to notice something. The more you practice presence, the less power your emotions have over you. The anger still comes, but it no longer stays. The sadness visits, but it doesn't root. You see the fear, and instead of running, you breathe. And in that breath, you come home to yourself. You are no longer a prisoner to the rise and fall of your emotions. You are the ocean beneath the waves, still, deep, unmoved. And yet this is not about detaching from life. This is not about becoming cold or indifferent. It's about engaging with life even more fully, but from a place of groundedness. When you are no longer thrown off balance by every change, you can finally show up with authenticity. When your peace is not based on things going your way, it becomes unshakable. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It happens in small moments. When you pause before speaking, when you feel the urge to lash out, but instead choose breath. When you wake up and sit for 5 minutes just to notice your breath before the noise of the world floods in. These are the places where transformation hides, in the ordinary, in the quiet, in the now. And as you walk this path, your mind becomes less like a battlefield and more like a garden. You stop planting seeds of fear, anger, resentment. You start sowing calm, clarity, compassion. And what you cultivate inside, you begin to offer outside. You speak with more care. You listen with more depth. You live with more lightness. Eventually, emotional mastery is no longer something you're striving for. It becomes who you are. Not because you're perfect, but because you're present, because you're awake to the truth that emotions will come and go, but you are not them. You are the space they move through. You are the awareness behind them. And in that awareness, you are free. The journey toward emotional clarity doesn't ask you to suppress how you feel. It asks you to sit beside your feelings without flinching, without rushing to silence them, and most importantly, without letting them dictate your next move. For so long, we've been taught to categorize emotions into good and bad, positive and negative, acceptable and shameful. But this dichotomy has done more harm than healing, because even anger has wisdom, even sadness has a message, even fear has a voice that deserves to be heard, not obeyed blindly, but honored gently. So you begin to listen, not to judge, but to understand. You stop trying to immediately replace sorrow with happiness. You stop trying to bury discomfort beneath distraction. You begin to treat every emotion as a visitor, arriving with something to teach you. And the moment you do that, a space opens up inside you. You are no longer a battlefield of inner conflict. You are a temple of understanding. You see it in the small things, when your patience stretches a little longer, when someone criticizes you and you don't feel the need to snap back, when sadness arrives in the evening and instead of pushing it away, you light a candle, make some tea, and sit with it like an old friend. This is what it means to be emotionally awake, not numb, not reactive, just awake. The teachings of the Buddha do not ask you to erase your humanity. They invite you to fully embrace it, to realize that every thought, every emotion, every reaction is part of the path, not a distraction from it. You don't need to wait until you feel perfectly calm to begin. You begin in the chaos. You begin in the noise. You begin wherever you are. And you return to the breath, not just during meditation, but as a way of living. The breath becomes your anchor in difficult conversations, in moments of stress, in the quiet of your solitude. You breathe, and in that breath you say, I am here, I am grounded. I do not need to chase this feeling or run from it. I only need to be with it. One of the most profound shifts happens when you stop trying to control your emotional landscape and instead become curious about it. Curiosity is different from analysis. It doesn't dissect or overthink. It simply observes with an open heart. What is this feeling? Where did it come from? What is it asking me to notice? This inner dialogue becomes a source of healing. You begin to understand your triggers, not to blame yourself or others, but to liberate yourself. You begin to see that the moments that once overwhelmed you were not signs of weakness, but calls for deeper presence. That the people who stirred your emotions weren't enemies. They were mirrors, revealing the parts of you that were asking for attention. And from this place of understanding, compassion blooms. Compassion not just for others, but for yourself. You realize that you've been hard on yourself for too long, that the voice in your head, the one that tells you you're not doing enough, not feeling the right way, not healing fast enough, that voice is not truth. It's an echo. And you don't have to believe it anymore. You can respond to that voice with gentleness. You can say, I hear you, but I'm not following you. You can say, I don't need to be perfect to be at peace. You can begin to parent your inner world with kindness instead of punishment. This is where real healing begins, not in changing who you are, but in changing how you treat yourself. The Buddhist path offers tools for this: mindful breathing, compassionate reflection, the practice of loving kindness. And as these tools become habits, your entire emotional experience begins to shift. You stop fearing anger. You stop running from grief. You stop avoiding discomfort. And you start trusting that you can feel deeply without falling apart. Because every emotion, no matter how intense, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It is not forever. It is not fatal. It is not who you are. You are the container, the presence, the space in which these emotions arise and fade. And the more you witness this, the more resilient you become. Not hardened, not closed off, but open, grounded, and clear. You begin to walk through life without needing every moment to feel good. You stop measuring the quality of your day by how many happy emotions you had. Instead, you measure it by how present you were, how honest you were with yourself, how gently you treated your own heart. And that redefinition changes everything. You start feeling lighter, not because your emotions have disappeared, but because they're no longer piled on top of each other, unexamined and repressed. They move through you like wind through trees, natural, inevitable, and always temporary. You feel a sadness pass through and you say, welcome. What do you need? You feel a flash of anger, and instead of throwing it, you breathe with it. Let it rise. Let it dissolve. This is emotional freedom, not the absence of feeling, but the mastery of moving through feelings without being defined by them. And you'll find that as your emotional clarity grows, your relationships shift. You listen more deeply. You react less harshly. You communicate with intention, not impulse. You hold space for others because you've learned to hold space for yourself. And in this way, your healing becomes a gift, not just to you, but to everyone you touch. There is no final destination, no moment where emotions stop arriving. But there is a way of being that allows you to meet each one with grace. There is a strength that doesn't come from holding it all together, but from letting it all move through you, trusting that you remain whole in the process. This is the strength you're building. This is the path you're walking, and every breath you take in presence is a step further into peace. Somewhere along the way, you begin to understand that emotions are not obstacles to overcome, but bridges to walk across. They take you somewhere deeper. They carry you into the truth of your experience, the unspoken parts of your life that your words never quite captured. And when you stop trying to avoid the discomfort and instead lean into it with curiosity, you begin to uncover pieces of yourself that you didn't even know were still waiting to be acknowledged. You remember the moments when your anger wasn't really about the thing that triggered you. It was about the years you spent not being heard. You realize the anxiety you felt in certain conversations wasn't about the present. It was the echo of old wounds where safety was denied. You see how your desire to fix everything quickly wasn't about control. It was about a long-standing fear that if you didn't, everything might collapse. And instead of judging yourself for these responses, you begin to soften. You say, "Of course I reacted that way. I was trying to protect something vulnerable." And with that compassion, something breaks open. Not in a destructive way, but in a liberating one. You're no longer held hostage by your reactions. You're no longer ashamed of the things you feel. You are, for the first time, truly seeing yourself with eyes that do not condemn, but understand. That's what the Buddhist teachings mean when they speak of awakening. It's not a flash of enlightenment. It's a slow return to the truth of who you've always been underneath the defenses, beneath the layers. It's the understanding that your emotions are not problems to fix. They are invitations. Each one is a doorway into presence. Each one asks you, will you stay with me? Will you listen instead of judge? Will you feel instead of flee? And when you start saying yes to those questions, something inside begins to change. You don't have to force it. You don't have to rush it. The healing comes in the allowing, in the witnessing, in the silence between judgment and understanding. There's a story told in Zen about a student who asked his teacher, "How do I find peace?" The teacher poured tea into the student's cup until it overflowed. The student shouted, "It's full, it's overflowing." And the teacher said, "Exactly. Your mind is like this cup full of expectations, judgments, and past thoughts. To find peace, first you must empty your cup. And so you begin to empty yours, not by forgetting everything you know, but by loosening your grip on the stories you've told yourself. The stories that said you had to be strong all the time. That feeling deeply was weakness, that emotions were distractions. You start to question those stories, and with every layer you peel away, you discover something softer underneath. A part of you that's always known how to be gentle. A part of you that never needed to fight so hard for love or respect or safety. That part of you begins to lead. And suddenly your inner world doesn't feel like a battleground anymore. It feels like a homecoming. You create rituals around your emotional life. Not grand rituals, but simple ones. A walk in silence, a journal entry before sleep, lighting a candle just to mark the end of a hard day. These moments, small as they are, become containers for your feelings. They become sacred spaces where nothing needs to be fixed or solved, only witnessed. And in these sacred moments, you remember how to be with yourself, not as a project, not as a problem, but as a person, worthy, valuable, and in process. You learn that emotions are energy in motion. They want to move through you, not live in you forever. And the less you resist them, the faster they flow. The more you judge them, the more they stagnate. So you let them pass, not because you're weak, but because you're wise enough to know that holding on hurts more than letting go. And slowly your inner dialogue shifts. You no longer say, "Why am I like this?" You begin to say, "Thank you for showing me this." You no longer say, "I shouldn't feel this way." You say, "It's okay that I do." This is radical kindness, the kind that transforms not just how you feel, but who you believe you are. You don't need to wait until you're healed to be kind to yourself. You don't need to wait until you feel peaceful to rest. You don't need to wait until you've figured it all out to live from love instead of fear. You can choose love right here, right now, in the middle of confusion, in the middle of feeling too much, in the middle of not knowing what's next. That's the true essence of presence. That's what the Buddha taught, that you don't need to escape your life to find peace. You only need to stop trying to escape yourself. And when you stop trying to escape, you return. You return to the body, to the breath, to the moment. You hear the birds outside again. You notice the way your hands move when you make tea. You feel the ground beneath your feet. You remember that this moment is what life is made of. You're no longer waiting for peace to come someday. You're choosing to meet it in the now, not by silencing your feelings, but by listening to them. Not by fixing everything, but by allowing what is. Not by running from discomfort, but by resting inside of it. This is what it means to live awake, not perfectly, but presently, not without emotion, but with awareness, not above your humanity, but deeply within it. And it's here, right here, that peace finally meets you. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is to stop, to pause when the world demands motion, to sit when your mind screams for distraction, to listen when all you want is to turn away. Because in that pause, uncomfortable as it may be, lies the gateway to transformation. It's there, in the stillness, that truth rises to the surface. Not the kind of truth you read in books or gather from others, but the kind that comes from silence itself, from your own breath, from your own body, from that quiet place inside you that has always known what matters. You realize that so much of what you once thought was necessary was actually noise. The constant drive to explain yourself, the internalized pressure to fix everyone else's perception, the belief that if you didn't stay on top of everything, everything would fall apart. But now you see that peace doesn't come from holding things together. Peace comes from letting go of the illusion that you ever had to. You start asking different questions, not how do I get through this as quickly as possible, but what is this moment teaching me? Not how do I avoid this feeling, but what is it asking me to understand? Not how do I protect myself from pain, but how do I sit with it so it doesn't grow in the dark? These questions don't offer quick fixes. They're not meant to. They're meant to guide you deeper, not into the pain, but into presence, into a way of relating to yourself that is honest, gentle, and free from the violence of self-abandonment. Because that's what most of us have been taught to do. Abandon ourselves in the name of survival. Smile through the ache, numb the anxiety, push through the grief. And yet in that avoidance, we miss the invitation, the one that says, come home. You are safe to feel. You begin to see that your emotions are not your enemies. They're not dangerous. They're messengers. And the ones that show up most often, the ones that feel repetitive, familiar, even frustrating, are not here to torment you. They're here to reveal where you've been carrying weight that was never yours, where you've been silencing parts of yourself that only wanted to speak, where you've been needing love and reaching for validation instead. And when you really begin to sit with this, without shame, without rushing, you start to see the outlines of your own healing. Not as a destination, but as a practice. One you return to, not because you're broken, but because you deserve to be whole. That practice might look different every day. Some days it's quiet reflection. Some days it's crying into your pillow at midnight. Some days it's telling someone the truth you've hidden for years. And some days it's simply choosing not to betray yourself for someone else's comfort. Every one of these is a victory. Every one of these is healing in motion. You don't have to broadcast it. You don't have to prove it. The world may not see the quiet shifts happening within you, but your soul does. Your body does. Your breath does. And that's enough. You begin to live less for performance and more for alignment. You stop chasing the high of external praise and start cultivating the steadiness of internal peace. You no longer ask, am I enough for them? You ask, is this true to me? You no longer force conversations where you aren't heard. You no longer stay in spaces that ask you to hide. You no longer perform your emotions to make others comfortable. You let them be. You let yourself be. There's a kind of magic in that honesty, not the sparkly, showy kind, the slow, sacred kind, the kind that feels like breathing again after holding it in for years, the kind that sounds like silence and feels like safety, the kind that says, I no longer need to be understood by everyone. I just need to understand myself. And in that understanding, you start making different choices. Not out of fear, but from knowing. You say no, not as rejection, but as protection. You walk away, not out of pride, but out of clarity. You let go, not because you don't care, But because you finally learn that caring doesn't have to cost your peace, you begin to see that peace is not a passive state. It is active. It is fierce. It is a daily choosing. Choosing to return to presence. Choosing to stay with yourself, even when the old patterns pull. Choosing to respond with love, even when pain tempts you toward anger. You stop fighting your emotions. You stop fearing your own depth. You stop running from what you feel, because you know now that nothing inside you is too much, that every feeling you've ever had was valid, that none of it makes you broken. It makes you beautifully human, and being human is not a flaw. It is a miracle. You were never meant to be a machine. You were never meant to be perfectly composed all the time. You were meant to feel, to stumble, to weep, to laugh from your gut, to grieve what mattered, to rejoice in what lasts, and to let all of it wash through you without needing to shut any part of it down. That's what it means to be alive, fully, honestly, undeniably. And when you live this way, not trying to be someone else, not trying to escape who you are, you begin to feel it, the peace that doesn't depend on conditions, the joy that isn't tied to outcomes, the love that doesn't waver when things go wrong, because it's all within you. It always was. There comes a point in your journey when you no longer seek permission to feel at peace. You no longer wait for the circumstances around you to soften, for people to apologize, for life to grant you a moment of stillness. You stop waiting because you realize peace was never something the world could give you. It was something you were always meant to reclaim from within. You stop tying your serenity to how others treat you. You stop tethering your sense of worth to whether or not things are going your way. Instead, you begin to ground yourself in something quieter, your own breath, your own presence, your own truth. That's where the shift begins, not in the outer world, but deep within you. And when that shift takes root, something else begins to fade. The need for everything to make sense. The need to wrap every emotion in logic. The need to explain your sadness, your rage, your joy. You simply let them live without shame. You stop needing to intellectualize your humanity and start choosing to live it. You begin to honor the parts of you that were once silenced, the little griefs you buried, the dreams you were told were foolish, the emotions that were too big, too messy, too inconvenient. You no longer shut them down. You no longer pretend they don't exist. You turn toward them and you listen. And when you listen, truly listen, they tell you everything. They tell you where the wound lives. They tell you what still hurts. They tell you how long you've carried a weight that was never meant to be yours. And instead of running from the pain, you lean in with compassion. You cradle the ache instead of cursing it. You breathe with it. You hold space for it to move, because you've realized that pain doesn't grow in the light of your presence. It transforms, not instantly, not always easily, but gradually, like ice melting in spring. Slowly, steadily, the tension begins to release. The grief begins to loosen its grip. The fear begins to dissolve, all because you stopped avoiding yourself. You begin to understand that healing doesn't mean never feeling pain again. It means trusting that when pain comes, it won't destroy you. It means knowing you can meet it, hold it, and still be whole. It means remembering that you are not defined by what you feel, but by the way you choose to walk through it, with awareness, with tenderness, with love. This choice becomes your new rhythm, not reacting, but responding, not fixing, but feeling, not forcing, but flowing. And as you live this way, day by day, breath by breath, you start to notice that peace no longer feels distant. It doesn't wait for you at the end of some grand accomplishment. It meets you in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, in the pause before you speak, in the gentle exhale after a difficult moment, in the quiet presence you offer yourself without needing a reason. Peace isn't something you chase anymore. It's something you create through practice, through presence, through patience. You begin to accept that things may not always be resolved the way you imagine, that some questions may remain unanswered, that some people may never understand you, but you make peace with that too. Because peace doesn't require perfect closure. It only asks for your willingness to keep returning to what's real, to what's here, to what's now. And in that return, you find your grounding. You find your clarity. You find the simple truth that you are not lost, that you've only ever been walking your own sacred path, learning how to be with yourself in ways no one ever taught you, that every misstep was still movement, that every detour held a lesson, that every pause was part of the unfolding. You begin to trust your process, not blindly, but intimately. You know it now. You know that growth doesn't always look like expansion. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Sometimes it looks like stepping back. Sometimes it looks like letting go of everything you thought you were supposed to be and finally allowing yourself to be what you are. Not less, not more, just whole. And wholeness doesn't mean completion. It means nothing is missing, even in your becoming. It means you are already worthy of your own kindness, already deserving of rest, already allowed to feel without explanation. You find freedom in that, the kind of freedom that doesn't need to shout, the kind that sits quietly beside you, reminding you that you don't need to perform to be loved, that your softness is strength, that your vulnerability is a bridge, not a weakness, that your presence is enough. You walk through your life a little lighter now, not because everything is easier, but because you're no longer carrying things you don't need. You're no longer proving anything to anyone. You're simply showing up, breathing, being, living. And maybe, just maybe, that's what healing really is. Not fixing every broken piece, not finding every missing answer, but learning to walk with yourself exactly as you are, through everything life brings, and never abandoning your own side again. There's something beautiful that begins to bloom when you no longer fear your own depth, when you stop shrinking away from your feelings as if they're intruders, and start recognizing them as your oldest companions. The emotions that rise, even the ones you've been taught to reject, all carry remnants of your story, memories unspoken, moments unprocessed, truths that once felt too heavy to hold. But now you're learning to hold them, not out of obligation, but out of reverence. Because when you hold your feelings with tenderness, they soften. They don't demand as much space. They don't scream quite so loudly. They don't sabotage your peace. They simply begin to rest, like a child who finally feels safe enough to sleep. You begin to create an inner environment where nothing is unwelcome. You no longer exile parts of yourself in order to feel worthy. You no longer pretend away the sadness, hoping it will vanish in denial. You no longer armor yourself with anger to mask the ache underneath. Instead, you breathe, you allow, you listen. And in listening, you learn something else. You learn to discern the voice of your soul from the voice of your wounds. Your wounds will always be the ones that speak in panic. They'll tell you you're not safe, that you're not enough, that you must run, fight, hide. But the soul's voice is different. It speaks with quiet assurance. It doesn't push. It doesn't panic. It simply invites you back to center. You've started to hear that voice more often now, in the quiet moments, in the stillness between thoughts, in the calm that follows surrender. It's the voice that whispers, "Slow down. There is no race. You are not late for your own life." And you believe it, not because it shouts, but because it feels true in your body. You feel it in your chest, in your breath, in your bones. This new way of living doesn't always make sense to others. They may wonder why you don't rush the way you used to, why you don't argue like you once did, why you're no longer interested in proving your point. But you know now that peace isn't about being right. It's about being rooted. and you're more interested in being rooted. Rooted in your truth, rooted in your presence, rooted in your own quiet knowing. You no longer hand your peace to anyone else to hold. You don't let their moods dictate your internal climate. You don't let their judgments decide your value. You don't let their chaos become your own. Not because you've stopped caring, but because you've finally started caring in a different way, one that includes you. There's a gentleness to this way of being, a grace. It's not flashy, it doesn't need attention, it simply exists, like a river flowing beneath the surface. Quiet, steady, powerful. You begin to trust that you don't need to push to move forward. That alignment will carry you farther than effort ever could. That presence, real presence, is more transformative than any plan. You start measuring success differently now, not by how busy your schedule is or how many people approve of you, but by how peaceful you feel in your own body, by how kind you are when no one's watching, by how deeply you breathe when the world begins to spin. You begin to unlearn the urgency. You stop treating life like a checklist. You let go of the narrative that healing must happen on a timeline, and instead you begin to honor the seasons of your soul. Some seasons are for blooming, some are for resting, some are for releasing, and all are sacred. You've stopped asking, when will I get there? And started wondering, how can I be here more fully? Because you know now that presence is the real arrival, that when you meet yourself in this moment, without judgment, without resistance, you meet life itself. This is not about escaping your feelings. It's about walking beside them without letting them lead. It's about learning to comfort yourself instead of criticize. It's about making space for the messy, the confusing, the contradictory, and holding all of it with love. You stop needing your healing to look beautiful. You allow it to be raw, unpolished, honest. You know now that beauty isn't in perfection, it's in truth. And the truest thing you can do is to be with yourself exactly as you are. You also begin to stop absorbing the emotional weight of others. You understand now that empathy doesn't require self-sacrifice, that you can feel with others without caring what isn't yours. You learn to listen without losing your center. You learn to love without abandoning yourself. You learn to give without depleting. This emotional clarity brings with it boundaries, not walls, but wisdom. You know what nurtures you. You know what drains you. And you no longer feel guilty for protecting your peace, because peace is sacred. It's not something to be negotiated or explained. It's something you choose every day in 1,000 small ways. By the time the world sees your transformation, it's already well underway. They see the calm, but they don't always see the chaos you held with grace. They see the softness, but not the strength it took to stop running. They see the clarity, but not the confusion that preceded it. And that's okay. You don't need them to see it all. You know, and that knowing is enough. You are no longer waiting for someone else to validate your journey. You are no longer waiting for the world to confirm your worth. You walk now with a quiet confidence, not born of ego, but of self-understanding. You don't just believe you deserve peace, you embody it, one breath at a time. It's a strange and beautiful thing when your life begins to soften. Not because everything gets easier, but because you've stopped resisting what is. There's a tenderness that forms in the space where struggle used to live. You begin to see the storm not as a threat, but as a teacher. You no longer rush to escape discomfort. You meet it eye to eye, heart to heart, and somehow it doesn't consume you like it once did. You stand there, still breathing, still grounded, and you realize that you've grown roots where there once was only survival. You no longer expect the world to change so you can feel peace. You change your relationship with the world instead. You begin to walk through your days without carrying so much armor. Not because life can't still hurt, but because your softness has become your strength. You've realized that being gentle with yourself isn't indulgent, it's revolutionary. And in a world that demands constant productivity and emotional performance, your softness is your quiet rebellion. You start to love yourself in ways you never thought possible, not through affirmations or forced positivity, but through presence, real, raw, unfiltered presence. You sit with yourself when you're anxious. You stay with yourself when you're grieving. You celebrate yourself even when no one else notices your small victories. And slowly, this companionship you've built with yourself becomes the most healing relationship of all. You become less interested in who is watching you and more focused on how you feel within your own skin. You wear your truth not as a shield, but as a second skin, one you no longer apologize for. You speak more slowly now, not because you're unsure, but because you've learned the value of choosing words that don't betray your inner clarity. You move more intentionally not to impress, but to stay in rhythm with what's real. This rhythm is sacred, it's unique to you. It doesn't match the pace of the world around you. It's slower, deeper, more embodied. It's a rhythm that doesn't need validation, doesn't crave applause. It is rooted in your breath, in your steps, in the stillness you've come to call home. And home is exactly what this feels like. Not a place, not a person, not a destination, but a state of being where you are no longer at war with yourself. You stop waking up each day with a battle plan. You stop bracing yourself for what might go wrong. You open your eyes and instead ask, how can I stay connected today? Connected to your breath, your truth, your peace. The chaos might still come, the discomfort might still visit, but your response has changed. You no longer collapse. You no longer abandon yourself. You sit down in the middle of it all, place your hand on your heart and say, we are still here. And that somehow is enough. You stop needing to control everything. You stop fearing the unknown. You realize that not knowing isn't failure. It's space. Space for something new to emerge. Space for insight. Space for a different outcome than the one you tried to force. You trust that the not knowing is fertile ground, not emptiness. And from that ground, clarity blooms. Not because you demanded it, but because you waited, because you trusted, because you allowed. You also stop trying to be everything for everyone. You stop bending, twisting, performing. You stop sacrificing your own needs to keep the peace. You stop giving from an empty cup. You understand now that your presence is the gift, not your compliance, not your self-abandonment, but your authenticity. So you give differently now. You give without losing yourself. You give when you're full, not when you're drained. You give from joy, not from guilt. And when you don't have it to give, you rest, without apology, without explanation. Rest becomes sacred to you, not as a break from productivity, but as a return to presence. You no longer see rest as lazy. You see it as necessary, as holy, as a way to come back to yourself when the world has pulled you in every direction. You stop earning your rest. You claim it. You protect it. You also begin to forgive yourself for the years you spent fighting the wrong battles, for the times you didn't know how to cope, for the seasons where you silenced yourself to keep someone else comfortable, for all the ways you didn't know how to love yourself yet. You don't carry shame for who you were. You carry grace. You carry compassion. You carry the understanding that you were learning, and learning is never wrong. You begin to notice how much lighter life feels when you stop demanding so much from it. When you stop trying to extract meaning from every moment. When you let things be just what they are, nothing more, nothing less. A smile, a conversation, a moment of grief, a quiet walk. You let them exist without turning them into a lesson. And somehow, in that freedom, the meaning reveals itself. You are no longer obsessed with growth. You're devoted to presence. You are no longer focused on fixing. You are focused on feeling. You don't ask, how can I get rid of this? You ask, how can I be with this lovingly? And in that, you find the kind of transformation that lasts. Not the transformation that's loud or dramatic, but the kind that roots itself into your being and subtly shifts everything you touch. You walk differently now, you love differently, you rest differently, you speak to yourself with more kindness, you show up for your life with more reverence, and that reverence, gentle, quiet, unwavering, is your peace. There's something indescribably sacred about realizing that you don't have to chase anything anymore. Not love, not worth, not even healing. You begin to see that the more you chase peace, the more it slipped through your fingers, not because it was unreachable, but because you were always running in the opposite direction. Peace doesn't come through the pursuit, it comes through the pause, the surrender. The moment you finally decide to sit with yourself exactly as you are, without needing to fix or force or prove anything, you look back and see how long you've run, through relationships, through achievements, through endless doing. You see how often you tried to earn your own love, not realizing it was already yours to give. You see how many times you confused exhaustion with success, numbness with strength, silence with peace, and you don't judge yourself for any of it. You just soften. You offer the version of yourself who didn't know better the grace they never received. You say to them, "Thank you for surviving. You can rest now." That rest, when it finally comes, is not the kind of sleep you fall into from burnout. It's the kind of rest that feels like coming home,